Hey everybody, welcome back. Again, we're just grateful, continue to be grateful that you all want to take this journey with us and be a part of this discipleship movement here in our conference. Last week when we were together, we talked about the spiritual dead and how we share our faith so that they can come alive and become spiritual infants, and how they can grow. How you relate your own story about how Jesus has changed you to someone so that they can hear that for the very first time. Tonight we're going to move on to the next step, which is spiritual children. So Jim, why don't you tell them a little bit about that?
Well, as you know, spiritual children can be very difficult. And some of the phrases from the stage of a child is, I really didn't get anything out of the sermon this week. I'm probably going to have to go some other place so I can be fed. Or, why don't they play that wild contemporary music? I much prefer the old hymns. Or, why is it so hot in here today? Nobody ever adjusts the air properly in the church. There are all kinds of things. Now, some of these are legitimate complaints.
Right.
So I'm not condemning everybody who says that as a spiritual child, but there are a lot of people in our churches who are spiritual children. And it requires great patience when you're working with a spiritual child. You need to connect them to God. You need to connect them to a purpose that's much bigger than themselves. And you need to connect them to a small group. Because in a small group, as you know, Drew, that's where people can be honest and can be real. And there people can come alongside a spiritual child and help them get past some of these really difficult things. Unfortunately, there are people who've been Christians in our churches for 20, 30, 40 years. They've never passed the stage of childhood. And so we don't want to track them down next week in church and say, I know what's wrong with you. You're a spiritual child. But we do want to be able to help them and be patient with them and learn in this section how to relate to a spiritual child.
That's right. I think about a lot of, I'm a parent myself. I have 4 children, and my youngest is 2, and at 2 years old she's in the stage where she tells me no a lot, or I'll do it myself a lot, or I don't like that, or you can't make me do that. And it's interesting, not to belittle or disparage people who are spiritual children. I don't mean it in that way, but it's a powerful analogy for me to think about how I relate, because honestly, she's a child. There's things that I wouldn't expect her to do. There's expectations weights I wouldn't put on her. And so when we think about it in that context, how we can help people take their next step, we also understand that we have a heavier responsibility with someone who's in that stage, because they don't know what they don't know, right? Yep. So what we're hoping tonight is that this discussion will be formative for you in a way that will help you see how you can help spiritual children. When you finish your discussion, come back to us and we'll wrap everything up for you.
So we've been talking a lot about relationships, especially relationships with children. And if someone is a spiritual child, there's bound to be conflict. It's inevitable. So day 5 talked about how to handle conflict. I hope in your group that you spent some time discussing that. Church isn't the absence of conflict. You should never expect that there's going to be zero conflict in your church. In fact, that's not something that we should expect, because if you're married, you probably have conflict with your spouse, right? If you have a good friend, you probably had conflict. So we're going to have conflict in our churches, and how to deal with it is the most important thing. So if you didn't look at day 5, I challenge you to do that, because Drew, we know you've got to solve conflicts, and resolving conflict will help you grow.
Yeah, and the challenge for us is oftentimes we want to handle it biblically in the sense of stoning and gnashing of teeth and dragging out into outer darkness, but that's just not the way the gospel works. Yep. And it's not going to help anyone take their next step towards Christ either. One of the things I was thinking about when dealing with spiritual children is oftentimes the first thing we want to do is just push them aside, right? Yeah. It's when someone comes up to us and they're complaining about the bulletin for the 35th time and we just can't take it anymore, and we want to say, please leave me alone. But the challenge we want to issue to you is to think about spiritual children in a different way. Think about it in terms of, okay, yes, they have these pestering issues, these things that may be coming at us that are frustrating, but they also have challenges in their own life that the gospel, that the Holy Spirit can help them overcome. And if we're intentional leaders like we claim to be, then it's our job to help them walk through that time. So think about our challenge this week. Think about the spiritual children in your life. Don't go up to them and call them spiritual children. Don't chase them down and try to create conflict. But think really intentionally from a place of love, from a place of grace, and from a place where you want to share truth with them that will help them grow. Pray about those people and pray about how God might be calling you to lead or to help or to challenge those spiritual children to take their next step in Christ. Because we don't want to remain spiritual children forever, right? We want to take our next step into young adulthood and from there into spiritual parenthood. I mean, the greatest miracle that could be a part of any of our churches is for every spiritual child in our church to eventually become a spiritual parent that is discipling someone else.
Wow.
What a miracle story that you could share if that would happen. So go back and think about those. Pray about that this week, and we'll have some more content to share with you next time.